Welcome to this side event. My microphone is on, so ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, welcome to this side event. My name is David Orr. I have been one of the co-chairs of an important project jointly run by UNECE-Housing Europe and UN-Habitat called #Housing 2030, which forms the basis for the session that we are about to run. We have a large number of speakers in a short time, so we're going to be very disciplined about the amount of time that each of us will have. And on behalf of all of the speakers, I want to say how pleased we are to have this opportunity to be involved in a side event at COP26. This is an important event for us. We cannot reach net zero without decarbonising our homes. I'm going to repeat that. There is no way on the planet that we can reach net zero without decarbonising our homes and buildings. That's why for us, this particular event is so important, because what we want to do today in the various presentations that you will hear from the report and from other people in different parts of the world is active, practical examples of what we are already doing and what can be done to help us towards that goal. To kick things off, we were due to be addressed by Councillor Susan Aitken, the leader of Glasgow City Council. I'm very sorry to have to tell you that Susan is quarantining as a result of close proximity with someone who tested positive for COVID. These are the times we live in. But I am delighted to say that we already have on the platform Glasgow City's urbanist, Brian Evans. Now, Brian is going to be saying a little more shortly, but for now, Brian is going to do his stand-in impression of Councillor Aitken. Brian, I'm grateful to you for doing that, and please pass our best wishes to Susan when you see her.
I'll do that. David, thank you. Executive Secretary, distinguished guests, good afternoon. A very warm welcome to our wonderful city of Glasgow and to the UNFCCC Climate Neutral Housing event. Discussions like today's are a clear sign that COP26 is really getting into the substance of what climate action means for its host city and for our urban peers across the planet. These past few days, we have had an opportunity to tell Glasgow's story to the world. It's a story with a very particular context, a city with deep roots in empire and the first industrial revolution. It's also one which our peers who have suffered from the impacts of deindustrialization and contend with its legacies will recognize. But our story also tells of how, as we stand on the cusp of new accelerating change, we've learned from that past and prioritized the needs of our citizens in the transition agenda. Here in Glasgow, climate and social justice are as conjoined as they are anywhere, and housing has been central to shaping Glasgow's transformation and the well-being of its people. On our road to COP, Glasgow has had the privilege of having a seat at the top table in the discussions on cities as the challenges and solutions to the world's climate issues faces. And within that, the recognition of how we heat or indeed cool our homes are central to this process, as our moderator has just outlined. I'm hugely proud of the work we're advancing. Glasgow's emerging plan for the necessary interventions to reach net zero by 2030, our green print for investment, places the decarbonisation of homes front and centre of those priorities. But what gives me most confidence is how, again, the need to continue to address our social challenges around health, inclusion, connectivity and fuel poverty, as well as skills, economic recovery and growth are central to our plans. I wish you all the very best in this event. Thank you for listening. Back to you, David.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'm pleased to say that we have opening remarks for this event from the three participants, the three partners in the Housing 2030 work. And first, here in person, I'm very pleased to introduce Olga Yerova, who is the Executive Secretary of UNECE.
Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues, dear supporters of climate-neutral housing. Welcome here today. It's my great pleasure to welcome you at our today's session on decarbonizing the housing stock in an inclusive and affordable way. I wish to thank especially to the Glasgow City Council and namely to Susan Aitken, and my best regards to her, please, for their standing support, our partnership, together with the Housing Europe and UN-Habitat in our hashtag Housing 2030 initiative. Buildings have the largest potential for improving energy efficiency and mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. However, on a practical level, decarbonizing buildings is very costly. In the UNECE region, even before the recent increase in energy prices, almost 42 million faced arrears on their utility bills, and more than 52 million couldn't keep their home adequately warm, and unfortunately these numbers are still growing. There is a need in developing innovative housing construction and renovation programs that promote carbon neutrality that are affordable for all. Such programs are essential to meeting the related SDGs, the goals of the Paris Agreement, as well as to ensure protection of the vulnerable groups in order to not to leave anyone behind. Ladies and gentlemen, back in 2015, the 56 UNECE member states endorsed Geneva Charter on Sustainable Housing. The Charter is based on 4 interconnected principles, and that is environmental protection, economic effectiveness, social inclusion and participation, and finally, cultural adequacy. Based on the principles of this Charter, in 2021, the Housing 2030 effective policies for affordable housing in the UNECE region, that was a study. A study was developed which focuses on solutions to the housing affordability crisis in the UNECE region. It addresses 4 topics. The first is housing governance and regulation. Second, access to finance and funding. Third, access and availability of land for housing construction. And the fourth is the climate neutral housing construction and renovation. Together with the study, an interactive web portal was launched and contains best practices, online trainings and publications. And I wish to invite you all to share information and to share your experiences and best practices on the website www.housing2030.org. Today, we will discuss the toolkit on affordable climate-neutral housing. We'll also speak about the place and life in the ECE Regional Action Plan 2030, which was endorsed just last month by UNECE ministers responsible for housing and urban development. I really believe it's a powerful document which provides us with clear priorities to make housing in the UNECE region more sustainable, energy efficient and affordable for all. The Regional Action Plan, developed with the support of the Glasgow Urban Lab, a UNECE Centre of Excellence, which is a partnership between the Glasgow School of Art and Glasgow City Council for capacity building on sustainable urban development. Just yesterday we signed up 12 new centers of excellence in our network of the High Performance Building Initiative. And the father of this initiative, Mr. Scott Foster, is sitting here with us. We would ask you to join. It is a great opportunity to deliver tangible results now and also in the future. So I wish you just a dynamic, fruitful dialogue. Let us work together to make cities more sustainable and better place for all of us to live in. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed. And I would echo what a fruitful and dynamic partnership it's been between UNECE and Housing Europe and UN-Habitat. So the next of our speakers, the first of our online guests, is Bent Madsen, who's the president of Housing Europe.
Thank you very much, David.
Thank you.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. On behalf of Housing Europe, it's my sincere pleasure today to welcome you to this side event at COP26 in Glasgow. The question we look at today is one of the most important and one of the most fundamental problems. How can we decarbonize our homes in a way that is affordable and accessible? When the European Commission Executive President Frans Timmermans launched the EU 2030 climate plan a few months ago, he said, it's important. Fairness is the key. Our ambition should help, not hurt, the most vulnerable in the society. This transition will be just, or there will be no transition. That is a very powerful statement. The green transition is for all of us, and it must not serve to widen the socioeconomic divisions in our communities, which I think the pandemic has once again so clearly highlighted. Green sustainability and social sustainability should go hand in hand. One thing is to say that we have such an ambition, and it's an entirely other thing and different thing to live by it and to make it a reality. The Housing 2030 report can help us to point the way to the policymakers how to do it. And I will have your attention to the fourth chapter in our main report, Climate Neutral Housing.
I've lost it. That's the one with headphones. So, ladies and gentlemen, we appear to have had a small technical challenge there. We think that Bent may have accidentally muted himself. If we can get him back, we may do so. But certainly for now, I think we should move on. And our next online presentation is from Robert Lewis-Lettington, who is the Chief of Section for UN-Habitat.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
We can.
Excellent. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, partners, dear friends, I would like to thank the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, as well as Housing Europe, UN Environment, and the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights for co-sponsoring this meeting. UN-Habitat is proud to have partnered with UNECE and Housing Europe, creating the study Housing 2030, Effective Policies for Affordable Housing in the UNECE region, as it recognizes the important link between housing and climate change, as well as offering tools and measures to ensure sustainable and resilient cities. Housing affordability and decarbonization of the housing stock are intertwined pathways to tackle climate change. The buildings and construction sector, the majority of which is housing, accounts for up to 39% of process-related carbon dioxide emissions. The buildings sector consumes 12% of fresh water, 30% of raw materials, and generates approximately 20% of water effluents and as much as 40% of landfill waste globally. Once built, housing also consumes significant amounts of energy. Households account for about 90% of total worldwide energy consumption. Improving the energy performance of homes could pave the way for energy-cost residents to have decreased costs in utility bills. However, if such efforts are not accompanied by measures that promote affordability, housing costs could increase and further marginalize those on low incomes. For example, in our host UK, it is estimated that every household could save between £70 and £260 in energy bills per year with design and energy performance measures implemented effectively across the board. UN-Habitat seeks to promote sustainable housing design with all partners. This includes the promotion of incentives and the reformulation of building codes that will, 1, improve insulation, promote passive design features and nature-based solutions, 2, promote the use of incentives, subsidies, and tailored measures that protect housing cost-burdened families while promoting sustainable construction techniques, renovation, and the improved building insulation utilities. Also, policies that tackle the reduction of CO2 can also enable the provision of housing with access to transportation and other services, contributing to increasing inclusivity and equality in cities, as well as further decreasing. I would like to conclude by again thanking the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, Housing Europe, as well as the excellent team of authors that have developed this practical policy toolkit to support national and local governments to formulate viable solutions and appropriate policies for their specific needs. Our utmost to bring this to the attention of member states, promote its adoption not only in the ECE region, but also as an inspiration for work in other regions. I wish you all a fruitful discussion and look forward to continuing our partnership to promote sustainable housing practices in the ECE region and beyond. Thank you.
So many thanks, Robert. Again, I apologise for the slight technical difficulties that we're experiencing. Let's hope that all of that improves as we go through. Our next speaker is actually a video presentation. So we've got that in the can, and it is, I'm very pleased to say, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing, Mr. Balakrishnan Rajagopal. So if we can have that video, please.
Distinguished participants, friends, I'm happy to speak to you virtually at this important COP26 event on climate neutral housing, organized by the UNECE in cooperation with Housing Europe, UN-Habitat, UNEP, and OHCHR. Climate change is a pressing issue for many fundamental rights, including the right to adequate housing, and is one of my major thematic priorities as Special Rapporteur, as I reported earlier this year to the UN Human Rights Council, and will be the focus of my report to the UN General Assembly next fall in 2022. There is a momentum behind it. Just last month, the UN Human Rights Council created a new mechanism, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Climate Change, and recognized the right to environment as a human right. The negative impacts of climate change on housing is as wide-ranging as it is indisputable. As more people flee geographic areas affected by climate change, they not only lose their homes, but their right to housing at their receiving locations becomes endangered due to overcrowding, insecurity, and fragility. Drought, floods, and erratic rainfalls result in crop failures in different world regions, causing people to flee previously productive regions in search of work and sustenance. Many of these people end up in cities, adding to already existing social pressures, contributing to overcrowding and rising housing costs. According to this year's global report on internal displacement, more than 98% of the 30.7 million new displacements of people in 2020 were the result of weather-related hazards, such as storms and floods. These were concentrated in East Asia and the Pacific and South Asia, with just 5 countries accounting for more than 60% of the new internal displacements due to disasters. According to one estimate, over 1 billion people may be displaced by 2050 due to environmental changes, conflict, and civil unrest. This massive tsunami of coming displacements must be planned for, mitigated, and dealt with in a humane way. Red lights are blinking, and we must plan and act. Climate change presents long-lasting impacts on the right to housing, but at the same time, the housing sector contributes significantly to greenhouse gas emissions. The way we build housing is a cause, not just a consequence of climate change. According to the Housing 2030 study, buildings consume over 70% of the electrical power generated and 40% of primary energy and are responsible for 40% of CO2 emissions from combustion in economically developed countries. Building-related CO2 emissions are also of concern in emerging economies such as Brazil and South Africa and pose a huge threat in rapidly urbanizing continents such as Africa. Land use policies encourage growth-intensive and wasteful development in too many emerging economies. There is therefore an urgent need to move towards a decarbonization of the housing stock and together to implement climate change mitigation and adaptation policies in a human rights compliant manner. Since I took over as rapporteur, I have observed that in many different corners of the world, the right to adequate housing is increasingly threatened by poor governance, corruption, mismanagement of climate and urban policies, and systemic discrimination against historically marginalized communities. Evictions, land grabbing, displacements, exposure to pandemics like COVID-19, and social conflicts are too often the result, which all affect marginalized communities much more disproportionately. Unfortunately, most mechanisms directed towards mitigating, coping, and adapting to climate change, which have been implemented thus far, reproduce existing inequalities. Those exposed to the worst impacts of climate change are often the most marginalized in terms of resources and access to decision-making, and are often historically discriminated and the least equipped to manage the associated risks. Climate mitigation and adaptation policies should protect rather than harm people living in precarious housing conditions and should reduce the wastefulness implied in the fascination with ever-increasing standards of living. We are all affected. Our societies have been moving at a worldwide pace towards an unsustainable future. We need to hit the pause button and reevaluate the way we define our quality of life and the meaning of adequate standard of living, including under Article 11 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that we are aiming for. What is the meaning of ever-increasing standard of living in a world facing climate catastrophe? Is it okay to live in luxury when there is no clean air, safe drinking water, healthful food, and pristine nature left to share with everyone? What good are our homes if they cannot provide shelter against the impending disasters that come with climate change? Or if they make the planet more unlivable? We need to put our minds together and reimagine a carbon neutral housing that will sustain our present and our future. And let us all live together in solidarity and peace. We need to develop new technologies that allow us to achieve this effectively, fairly, and expeditiously. This conversation is really timely. I look forward to hearing what the panel members have to bring to this debate and how these conversations lead to meaningful action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. We have to reimagine our housing. It's absolutely the right way to put it, I think. We are now going to move on to a presentation which is based on some of the key issues that are covered in the Housing 2030 study. And I'm delighted that we're going to be joined by the kind of coordinating author of the report, Julie Lawson, Honorary Associate Professor at the Centre for Urban Research at RMIT University in Melbourne, and Professor Holger Wollbaum, who's a Professor in Sustainable Building, Chalmers University, Sweden, who wrote the chapter on how we can green our homes. So, ladies and gentlemen, Julie first, then Holger in a seamless presentation.
Thank you, David. I'll just share my screen. So, thank you very much. Leaving no one behind while decarbonising homes and neighbourhoods is vital to meeting the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. Both can be achieved if we think and do differently when designing and implementing housing and urban policies. Housing 2030 builds capacity for such an effort. It demonstrates how responsible governance can ensure people and the planet are the focus. My name is Julie Lawson. I led the research team with Professors Wollbaum and Professor Norris. On behalf of UNEC, Housing Europe and UN Habitat, we want to share with you our Housing 2030 report. Unaffordable and high-emission housing is a result of ineffective housing market governance. But responsible, capable policymakers can turn this around. Housing 2030 focuses on reform in 4 strategic areas: housing governance, housing access to finance, access to land, and important for COP26, climate neutral housing construction and renovation. 70 policy tools are explained to allow for their customised use rather than a rigid blueprint. Over 100 illustrations demonstrate their application in diverse settings. Expanding this UNEC work can inform other UN regions too, in a culturally relevant way. Throughout COVID, Housing 2030 brought together key stakeholders across 56 countries to learn from each other, share evidence, and reflect on experience. 1,200 participants were directly involved via thematic and regional webinars. Thousands more were inspired by our solution-focused podcasts and video recordings. The evidence-based and participatory approach has been very productive. Housing 2030 has generated a comprehensive report, a solution-focused series of podcasts, and an updated website. Now everyone can learn, listen, and engage with Housing 2030 anytime, anywhere. So without further ado, I welcome Professor Holger Wollbaum, who made a really valuable contribution to Housing 30 on decarbonising housing in an inclusive and affordable way. Holger. Over to you, Holger.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Julie, for this excellent introduction into the Housing 2030 initiative. At COP26, it has been mentioned several times that the built environment has a key role to play to reach our global carbon goals. Taking the example of the European Union, the residential and commercial EU building stock account for around 36% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, with larger variation among the different member states, but most buildings are older than 50 years, built before minimum energy efficiency standards were implemented. This indicates that we must reduce the carbon emissions in the phase of operation of existing buildings for heating, cooling, and electricity. At the same time, we must provide new housing to accommodate around 2.4 billion new urban residents in developing countries by 2050. Furthermore, we have to acknowledge that in the UNECE region, more than 87 million people live in poor quality dwellings, and more than 52 million people cannot keep their homes adequately warm. And even in so-called richer societies, energy poverty is still a very dreadful reality. Based on these new facts, it is obvious that we must ensure that climate neutral and inclusive housing goes hand in hand. To achieve these goals of climate neutral and inclusive housing, we need to understand the drivers of energy poverty. And based on this understanding, we have to design a toolkit that acknowledges the diverse local and regional differences, such as the socio-economic situation, climate conditions, and combines it in a holistic way, these elements mentioned in the energy pyramid that you do see on the right hand of the slide. To enable all stakeholders in the built environment, but especially politicians, to develop a tailor-made toolkit for their city, region, or country, we have been invited by UNECE-UN-Habitat and Housing Europe to collect successful practices within the UNECE region. In this report that Julie just presented, we have looked into national strategies, procurement incentives, regulations, standards, non-regulatory policy initiatives, but also into capacity building and professional training. Due to time reasons, I will just show a very few examples here on the various slides. So a very important one is obviously the European Performance of Building Directive as a backbone to decarbonizing the existing homes, but as well to bring down energy consumption of new buildings. Very interesting initiatives from all around Europe or the UNECE region. This is what you can see here. And just to mention the EU taxonomy, channeling investment toward socially sustainable renovation. Non-regulatory policy initiatives. There we have looked into agreements and strategic plans, ensure focused efforts, set very ambitious targets and tailored context. Here, this is what has been developed by our friends in the Netherlands that are working on phasing out natural gas as the main source of heat supply. They have introduced in the so-called heat plan as a first goal to have 1.5 million households connected to a new heating system. And other countries also working on very ambitious tailored strategic plans like Austria, Estonia, you see it here, US and Russia. Financial initiatives, I'm not able to go through all of them, just to mention that direct public investments provides a strong instrument. They're really key for the transition that has been mentioned by my dear colleagues, talked about it earlier. Awareness raising and training. Billion euros are wasted annually because construction works have been carried out by unskilled people. The consequences are often severe for the inhabitants in terms of bad indoor environmental quality, structural damages, and higher energy costs. Training programs are key to assure damage-free construction projects. To conclude, what we have learned in our nearly 2 years journey is that to achieve climate neutral policies, they are available, but they have to speed up and to be expanded actually. What has to be done is to develop national strategies, coordinate special mobility plannings, use the financing, fiscal and regulatory tools available, working on or assuring that costs of renovation processes do not displace residents. All all of this has been mentioned and is part of what has been mentioned earlier by Olga in the Regional Action Plan 2030, Place and Life of UNECE that has been endorsed. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to hand over to my esteemed colleague, Professor Brian Mark Evans, Professor of Urbanism and Landscape at Mackintosh School of Architecture here in Glasgow.
Thank you very much indeed, Holger. I do commend the report. It's absolutely stashed full of really good practical examples. Housing2030.org, very easy to find. And I was in Geneva when UNEC ministers were all signing up to the action plan, including that really important thing about having a national strategy for this, which is going to be critical to achieving these objectives. As Holger said, I'm delighted once again to introduce Brian Evans, who is, in addition to the other things that we've mentioned, Director of the UNECE Centre for Excellence on Smart Sustainable Cities.
Thank you very much, and this time I am myself. Colleagues, Place and Life, the Regional Action Plan 2030, is an instrument for implementation and delivery. As such, it has and requires a reasoned justification for its purpose. There is a slide somewhere, but not one I can see at the moment, which sets out the documents and the transition from Agenda 2030 until the excellent research work published and endorsed recently by the ministers, Housing 2030. The plan elaborates a series of principles, goals, targets, and actions. And these are drawn from an analysis and synthesis of Agenda 2030, of the UN Secretary General's policy briefs following COVID, the Geneva UN Charter, and, of course, Housing 2030 itself. On the slide, you will see the URL to download the report. And I am now delighted to introduce the short film Living in Glasgow. In the film, we try to demonstrate our journey as a city. Secondly, to demonstrate how the UN Geneva Charter validates our approach as a city. And thirdly, how our work as a city in transition in turn builds on the Charter and the excellent work and research of Housing 2030, contributing to building the network of Geneva UN Charter centres across the UNECE region, from the Americas throughout Europe into the Central Asian republics and Russia. Can we run the film, please?
Across the UK and in Scotland, Glasgow has a growing reputation for social and affordable housing that has come to prominence in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. And now Glasgow has embarked on an ambitious programme of decarbonisation that puts people and place at the centre of the process to achieve net zero carbon by 2030. The modern history of Glasgow is characterised by 4 distinct eras. The first, from the middle of the 19th until the early 20th centuries, saw Glasgow grow from an agricultural and ecclesiastical centre to become an industrial giant. This growth gave the city status, prosperity, wealth and an international reputation as one of the biggest cities in the world. This growth, however, came at a price for Glasgow citizens who powered the city's development. By the early 20th century, living conditions had deteriorated badly. In the years following World War II, the city's industrial base, artificially supported by a wartime economy, suffered systemic failure, and Glasgow entered a second era of economic hardship and widespread poverty. A national policy to depopulate the city, together with experiments in modernist city planning, escalated deindustrialisation and decline, leading to displaced communities and impoverished people across the city. By the 1960s, the situation had become grave, and a major storm at the end of the decade caused citywide damage and destruction. From the efforts to create temporary repairs, a group of architecture students introduced a new paradigm of renewal that provided the impetus to establish citizen-led housing associations, creating a movement to repair and transform the tenements of the city, as it was realised that deindustrialisation and unemployment, not the city's stone buildings, were the determinants of poverty and ill health. This work led to a change in direction for national policy. Demolition and clearance of stone buildings was halted and replaced with a regeneration programme to improve existing housing and maintain communities within their neighbourhoods. As the 20th century closed, Glasgow embarked on a third era characterised by renewal, regeneration and cultural renaissance that rebuilt the city's reputation for life and place.
The Glasgow Development Agency thought it would be a good idea to try to build like they were doing in Berlin and sort of rebuild the city centre. Now, Glasgow has already been doing that in terms of saving the tenements and the Victorian heritage around, and the two ideas came together. The physical environment was absolutely tragic. It reached a really, really bad point. But when I arrived here working, there was a huge number of people who were totally committed to the area. There was a lot of healthy political and community activism, and there was a real desire to change things in many respects back to the way things used to be with the tenements. The critical factors were control of the land and a project champion. I would say also the backing and support at senior political and official level throughout the city, and a master plan is essential. The key thing that's given it longevity is the involvement of the local community. There's a real synergy between a desire for the right thing to be done and for when authorities use the right people to lead things off from a design perspective. The Gorbals community owns all of our housing. And from ownership flows control. They are in charge. They own the housing. They own the process. We want something fantastic here. We want the best of the modern design, which we were promised and we never got in the 60s. And we want the best of tenement living, which we had before the 1960s.
In 2003, in an era-defining moment, Glasgow's tenants voted for the voluntary transfer of city-owned housing to a newly established citywide Glasgow Housing Association. Development funding was transferred to Glasgow City Council as the strategic housing authority to deliver affordable housing to meet the city's diverse and changing needs, and to enable Glasgow to move forward with a housing-led regeneration programme shaped by local communities.
GHA is extremely proud of creating better homes, better lives and a better Glasgow. Regenerating communities is a big part of that, handing power back to people to improve their lives in the longer term. We want to do so much more in terms of continuing to consider the people who then live in those homes and the lives that they lead in those homes. A big organisation like GHA, in partnership with others, can do so much that really will improve the lives of people. The partnership working that we've established has definitely been key in propelling the ambitions that we've had forward. We wouldn't have been able to achieve all that we have without the excellent partnership working that we've have in place now with Glasgow City Council, with Scottish Government and with other stakeholders too. And let's face it, working in partnership isn't always easy. It takes some effort and it takes some give and take, but my goodness, it's very much worth doing it. And I can't stress strongly enough the importance of the tenant voice. It is at the core of every decision that's made, And as a tenant myself, it gives me great comfort.
By the end of the first decade of this century, Glasgow had established 8 transformation regeneration areas with a 10 to 15 year programme to deal with areas of the city still scarred by mid-20th century deindustrialisation, by putting city living through affordable housing at the heart of city regeneration. This work is being delivered by Transforming Communities Glasgow, a partnership between the Scottish Government, Glasgow City Council and the Glasgow Housing Association.
I think the regeneration areas are very much about creating new communities where people are involved. I think local people have been involved very much from the outset. What Transforming Communities Glasgow is about building genuine mixed communities where it's tenure blind, you can't tell whether it's a bought house, it's a social house or it's a mid-market rent. Local people are involved. I mean, local people are very much involved in kind of the designing of their communities and kind of forming the shape of their communities. Decent forms of housing, but they have all the facilities that go with that, the kind of local shop, leisure facilities, education, medical facilities, and that's what we're doing with many of the regeneration areas throughout the city.
Since the establishment of the Scottish Parliament, Glasgow has worked in partnership with the Scottish Government and with housing associations to retain and develop momentum in the provision of social and affordable housing across Glasgow and in the wider city region. Together, home to nearly 40% of Scotland's population.
The leadership shown by Transforming Communities Glasgow is really important, and the role of community-based housing associations has been absolutely critical. Partnership working is essential because we can't deliver housing to 2040 on our own. Sustainability and placemaking are very important. We need to make sure that we build sustainable homes that are affordable for people, but also it's not just about bricks and mortar. It is about the communities that those homes are located in, and we want to make sure that people have access to green space as well, and that's been so important during the pandemic. A good example of placemaking is Clyde Gateway, which is developing a large area of land, not just for homes, but for employment opportunities and leisure pursuits for local people. And it's a lasting legacy from the Commonwealth Games, which is also important. I think Scotland and Glasgow are leading the way in a just transition to net zero. And I think that's by putting people and communities at the heart of that transition.
Today, these programmes are continuing with increased attention on decarbonisation and the retrofitting needed to combat the climate emergency, through increased urgency to upscale programmes and working with residents and communities to better understand decisions around energy efficiency and heat decarbonisation. The work goes beyond the 70,000 historically and culturally important pre-1919 stone-built tenements that give Glasgow its characteristic look and feel, to embrace some 430,000 homes across the city region that will require adaptation to make them fit for the next 100 years, while dealing with fuel poverty and upskilling the construction sector in a partnership that is interconnected and place-based in this fourth era for modern Glasgow.
The Glasgow Standard is a set of principles for affordable housing in Glasgow, which raises the sustainability levels and the space standards of the housing that we provide. Introducing the Glasgow Standard has been a major success. It's been a change in the way that we think about how we build housing, but it has been embraced by the housing associations in the city. We were certainly one of the first local authorities in Scotland to provide passive house social housing. We have taken that a step further, and we have a trial project looking at a pre-1919 tenement property where we're retrofitting the full block to passive house EnerFit standard. The housing strategy and the housing investment programme both place a lot of emphasis on the place principle and about improving neighbourhoods and about 20-minute neighbourhoods. We try to make sure as much as possible that each of the new developments takes these principles into account when they're being developed, and that includes things like distance to shops, amenity space, parking, and all the things that make a good community.
In international practice, Glasgow was quick to embrace the 2013 United Nations Geneva Charter on Sustainable Housing, seeing its core principles of environmental protection, economic effectiveness, social inclusion and cultural adequacy as a validation of the city's own approach. And Glasgow, following the leadership of Vienna, staged UN conferences sending messages of support to the UNECE in implementing the Geneva Charter. This collaboration, begun in 2015, led to the establishment of a UN Charter Centre for Excellence based at the Glasgow Urban Lab, itself a partnership between the internationally renowned Glasgow School of Art and Glasgow City Council. The Urban Lab supports the UNECE in building a network of charter centres in a growing number of member states, including the Norman Foster Foundation in Madrid, with whom the Urban Lab collaborated on the preparation of Place and Life in the UNECE, a regional action plan for 2030, intended to assist member states tackle challenges arising from the COVID pandemic, climate and housing emergencies across regions, cities and neighbourhoods. The action plan, endorsed at the UNECE ministerial meeting of October 2021, furthers the principles of the Geneva UN Charter, adopts the findings of the Housing 2030 research, and introduces 3 new principles born out of the Secretary-General's 2020 policy briefs. Firstly, that cities are central to building back better. Secondly, cities cannot flourish without well-functioning housing systems. And thirdly, that housing, mobility, environment and economy are interrelated and require integrated responses. This recognises not only the importance of individual sustainable development goals, notably 11 and 13, but also their interrelated and indivisible nature, together with their vertical integration in global, national, subnational and local policy, design and delivery. From early beginnings in the 1970s, perhaps because they had a hand in the genesis of the community-led housing associations, the architectural and design community of Glasgow has played an important part in the quality of housing that has been delivered in the city over the last 3 decades. Enlightened procurement continues today in the urban, architectural and landscape design of the transformation regeneration areas. Glasgow's early growth resulted in a pattern of neighbourhoods that were adversely affected by deindustrialisation, but the pattern of place remains and will form the basis of a network of neighbourhoods that provide local goods and services for the people of Glasgow within a 20-minute walk, cycle or wheel from their home. Glasgow believes that access to sustainable, affordable housing is a right. It is important, therefore, that the delivery of such housing is a necessary component of modern city planning and design. Housing is a pre-eminent necessity, but is not by itself sufficient to effect the transition required. Only when supported by economic prosperity, environmental quality, sustainable movement systems and meaningful cultural life can we hope to have established the sufficient conditions for the integrated and indivisible delivery of the SDGs. All of those contributing here agree that the transition Glasgow will make needs to be clean, green and just, and it must be done in a way that provides hope to help Glasgow's people transform their lives and the places they inhabit.
Huge lessons to learn, I guess, as design's really important. You only get one hit at the design and building of something.
Tenant engagement, in my view, is vital for success.
I think we've produced some of the best quality social rented housing anywhere in Scotland.
I think mid-market rent's a really good idea because it's helped us save so much, and with it being such a difficult time just now to buy property.
I've got this house now, I love it.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I think the good news is that what you've seen there in Glasgow reflects its own history, but with adaptation is replicable in other cities around the world, and indeed there are other cities doing similar things. We're going to hear some of that now. We have some rapid-fire, very short presentations on examples from different parts of the world, and we're going to start with Sally Thomas, who is the Chief Executive of the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations.
Thank you, David. I'll try and be as rapid fire as I can. The Scottish Federation of Housing Associations is the national voice of Scotland's housing associations and cooperatives. And I'm proud of our members' work to drive down carbon emissions. Over half of Scotland's current social housing stock already achieves a good level of energy efficiency. And our members are determined to drive forward this progress, but they're grappling with many challenges, as you can all well imagine. The Scottish Government's ambition to deliver 110,000 low-carbon homes over the next 10 years is a welcome one, but with heat from buildings accounting for around 20% of Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions, we know the need to decarbonise existing homes is just as important. At the heart of this challenge, housing associations need to ensure tenants can still afford to pay their rent and operate their heating systems once gas boilers have gone and been replaced with cleaner but potentially much more expensive solutions. A third of social housing tenants living in fuel poverty in Scotland, higher than the national average of 25%, which is bad enough. I co-chaired a national task force recently, Zero Emissions in Social Housing, ZEST for short, which examined some of these challenges, and the recommendations provide the first steps towards a funding and legislative environment to meet this challenge. They also focus on fabric first, approaches to upgrading buildings which look at the fabric which is in the building to begin with as an intrinsic step to net zero carbon, and the need for increased funding to provide a just transition, a fair transition to net zero for people and communities. You've seen a lot about Glasgow just now, so I'm going to take you to Aberdeen, a city that's synonymous with fossil fuel and North Sea oil and gas extraction, and which is now looking to a future which is without fossil fuels. Scotland has an impressive and important national programme of area-based schemes which fund local authorities to deliver energy efficient programmes in areas with high fuel poverty. As part of this scheme, our members' Grampian Housing Association worked alongside Aberdeen City Council to deliver a retrofit programme involving external and internal wall insulation upgrades. This saw the properties improve from a Band D EPC energy efficiency rating to a Band B, so quite a leap up that ladder. And because it was a mixed tenure scheme, both private owners and social tenants benefited. The properties are now some of the most energy efficient in the country, leading to a dramatic reduction in heat loss and energy bills for tenants. Grampian Housing Association also trialled solar panels to provide hot water, which reduced tenants' energy costs, and provided a free energy advice service, helping householders to use their energy more efficiently to cut their bills. I could give you many more examples around the country here in Scotland of our members doing great work to protect their tenants and the planet, including new homes being built to passive house standards, off-site manufacturing of new homes, and supporting community energy projects. But we're very short of time, so I'm going to draw out 3 lessons from the work that I've described and the work we've seen in Glasgow. The first is that we need policies which recognise it is the poorest in our society who will be hit hardest by climate change, and we must build our response with them and for them so they don't lose out. Second, we need policies that emphasise the importance of upgrading existing stock as well as building new homes, giving priority to those people living in fuel poverty and ensuring there's funding available for the highest standards to be achieved. While in Scotland some of these pieces of the jigsaw are in place, there's a lot more to do, and housing associations and the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations can't do it alone. So my final lesson is about partnership being essential. My example involved a housing association working with the local council and with its tenants and communities as part of a Scottish Government scheme. And this kind of joint working, which brings together the national, local and individual perspectives, is what we need. I hope this has been interesting to share and to hear about. Thanks for listening. Together we can make this happen, and it's always impossible until it's done.
Thank you very much, Sally. That was great. We're now going to move to Santiago Sora Martinez de Toda, who is Councillor for International Affairs and Cooperation from Madrid.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me well, I hope?
We can.
Perfect. Thanks for organizing this session and inviting us to participate in it. To start with the broader picture, Madrid has approved in March the city roadmap towards climate neutrality. We changed to achieve a climate neutral city by 2050 and to reduce by 65% the greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 compared to 1990 levels. This is a greater ambition than the recently adopted target of 55% reduction of the European Green Deal. In this roadmap, the decarbonization of the residential sector is the largest contributor towards climate neutrality in Madrid. How are we acting to decarbonize housing while at the same time addressing the social needs? First, acting on the existing housing stock. We have set up a housing renovation program for improving insulation and energy efficiency with 110 million euros of subsidies from the municipal budget in 2 years. This program, in fact, has also a specific focus on higher percentages of subsidies for low-income neighborhoods and households so that renovation is affordable and accessible to all, and particularly to the vulnerable. We also aim to renovate more than 800,000 heating systems in households in the next 10 years, with the aim of phasing out the most polluting fossil fuels and transitioning towards electrical heat pumps. We dedicate 50 million euros of the municipal budget to subsidies for renewing these heating systems in 4 years. Second, we are also acting on the design and the specifications of new housing, and all the current and future social public housing projects, which are for the most vulnerable, are constructed to obtain the highest rate of energy efficiency, Class A. For instance, one of the most recent public housing buildings has been constructed following the passive house standards with close to zero energy consumption and with the small amount of energy required coming all from renewable sources produced in the building or nearby in the district. In this way, we move towards climate neutral housing. At the same time, we help to fight energy poverty among the most vulnerable people. And third, and finally, we are acting on the regulatory side. The new urban planning and construction regulations in the city are being modified and updated so that, for instance, green roofs, green walls, thicker walls for better insulation, renewable energy system all have a more favorable consideration in these regulations, so that these elements are excluded from, are not counted in the maximum volumes and square meters that are allowed in a specific building and project by the urban regulations. So we promote that all these elements are established more and more widely in the city. We continue to explore these regulation innovations with the regulatory sandbox we have established together with Climate Kick, which is the largest European initiative for innovation on climate action. And with this sandbox, we aim to identify and to correct regulatory barriers or gaps that may impede faster progress towards climate neutral housing. We work in this sandbox closely with the administration, the Madrid City Council, Climate Kick, and also with private companies in these public-private partnerships in the progress towards climate neutral housing and a climate neutral city of Madrid. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was some excellent examples from Madrid. Again, I believe replicable. We're now going to move to Jonathan Doohan, who's Programme Officer, Buildings and Construction from UNEP. Jonathan.
Yes, thank you. So I just wanted to talk more broadly about building decarbonization roadmaps, as we in UNEP are leading the Secretariat of the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. And under that alliance, we have developed a global roadmap and some regional roadmaps for the decarbonization of the sector that we are now bringing at the country level. We have engaged in Cambodia and in Vietnam to work with the Ministry of Construction to develop these roadmaps with the idea to strengthen, I would say, targets and actions that contribute to the national determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, because the sector has been, I would say, not sufficiently or prominently put forward under these national determined contributions. The way that we approach the development of the roadmaps is actually by building a multi-stakeholder approach, so bringing all the value chain stakeholders on board. And as a first step, what we do is actually establish what we call a National Alliance for Building and Construction that brings together the private sector and all the different actors to actually develop jointly the vision for the buildings and construction sector and for setting the targets and the priority actions. Overall, the feedback from the process has been that it has been very praised as a process that has highly valuable experience, specifically to contribute better to the understanding of the sector and the context and what may be required to successfully decarbonize. One of the main challenges that we actually have faced is usually data. The data on buildings and construction is absolutely critical if you want to be able to come up with strong quantitative targets and actions and show actually the real benefits from your decarbonization actions. And often actually the data is very difficult to find. In countries like Cambodia, which are least developed countries, for example, there is no clear data about the building stock. And without that data, it will also be very difficult for decision makers and countries actually to access financing, because the financiers, or at least if you want to access green finance, you will be able to show the impacts of your actions. And for that, you would need data. And so in this context, we are now working with some countries to introduce building passports. As building passports are seen by the community, the buildings and construction community, as one of the key tools that would help actually overcome this data challenge that they're facing. And we're currently working with Morocco to develop a specific building passport prototype that we will implement with Al Omran, who is the main social housing developer in Morocco. And the idea of the Moroccan government is actually to institutionalize the building passport to all their buildings. So what I meant to say here is that the data is really a critical challenge, and that overall it is really important that all the actors engage in collecting more data so that the evidence is there, both to show to, on the one hand, the decision makers on the actions and what can be the benefits, and on the other hand, to engage with the financiers and access what is green financing. And this approach is actually also something that social housing developers in Europe are very much interested about, especially looking at the wide stock of, or their large stock of different housing that they're having, in be able to develop some strategies for decarbonizing and identifying where to start the decarbonization and retrofitting for their building stock. So that's what I wanted to share with you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. Building passports and roadmaps, an integral part of the solution here. Our next speaker, I'm delighted to say, is Vivian Loftus, who's the Paul Mellon Chair in Architecture at Carnegie Mellon University in the USA. Vivian. Hi, you're on camera. We can see you.
Okay. Yeah, and you can hear me.
Yep.
Great, thank you. This is a privilege and a pleasure to be able to speak at the COP26 side event. I represent Carnegie Mellon, as well as the UN ECE High Performance Building Initiative and a National Academy of Science committee dedicated to accelerating decarbonization in the US. I have a few points that I think have not been made. Absolutely, the built environment must be the most aggressive set of actions for decarbonization. And in that end, there is no question that retrofitting existing buildings is the #1 action. In the US, we need to reduce almost 50 quads of energy by 2050 in order to make renewables allow us to achieve net zero. 14% of this reduction will be in investments in existing buildings. We need to absolutely look at ways in which we can improve windows, roofs, walls, and floors. But another 12% of this is focused on the importance of buying the right appliances and equipment. And we actually have to set immediate standards to ensure that only the top 20% of products are on the market in order to dramatically reduce the plug loads in buildings. Clearly, the electrification of our traditional heating systems from oil and gas will be a part of that dramatic reduction. We also need to set, for 10% of reduction, standards for all new buildings. We need to actually set net zero standards now. This goal is eminently achievable with existing professionals and existing technologies. And this will rapidly accelerate net zero energy improvements. Fourth, we need to embrace district systems, not just district energy, but geothermal exchange for heating and cooling, and innovative combined heating, cooling, and power technologies, which will allow us to dramatically reduce the energy cascades that are causing so much loss in our systems. Buildings are a critical part of the next generation electric grid. We need grid interactive efficient buildings because the buildings themselves will act as peak load managers and load shifters for our new emerging power grids. And finally, there's an extensive network of hard surfaces that we have been creating with roads and streets and sidewalks and parking lots and plazas. And these smart surfaces are significantly impacting our carbon production. We need to have smart surfaces, sustainable surfaces, less cement, less concrete, increased reflectivity to reduce urban heat island, increased porosity to reduce flooding, and increased green space and tree canopy to enhance biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and quality of life. And finally, we need to introduce photovoltaic surfaces and photovoltaic canopies that offer shade and renewable energy. Buildings are the most cost-effective and impactful investments we can make to dramatically reduce our carbon footprint worldwide. They also are the way to address inequities, to provide local employment, to ensure resiliency in the face of climate change, and to improve outdoor environmental quality. Thank you.
Vivian, that was brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. And our final speaker is Jessica Grove-Smith, who's a senior researcher for the Passive House Institute in Germany. Jessica.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me.
Yeah.
It's a great honor to be here. I'm part of this great panel. Dear audience, hello everyone. So we're here to present solutions on decarbonizing housing. And there are many aspects to this, but one very important topic of this are the emissions associated with the energy needed to operate buildings, as has been mentioned throughout the discussions today. So my name is Jessica Grove-Smith, and I'm here to present the Passive House concept as a successful case study of how we can build better. And build better in the sense that buildings are designed and built to need less energy over their long lifetime, and therefore produce less climate-damaging emissions year after year after year. Passive House has been mentioned throughout this session, so let's dive a little bit into detail of where it's come from and what it means. It's a voluntary performance-based building standard, which was developed exactly for the purpose of reducing energy needs. It has very, very clearly defined energy targets, and by designing to these energy performance targets with a careful quality assurance process, we managed to reliably reduce the energy input needed for heating and cooling, keeping buildings in a comfortable and also a healthy temperature range throughout the year with good indoor air quality. It's essentially a fabric-first approach combined with simple mechanical systems, making it an affordable solution. The first pilot project to the standard was built already 30 years ago here in Germany, driven by Wolfgang Feist and Bo Adamson. And this building is still in use today and has a track record of extremely low energy consumption. It uses as much as 90% less heating than the average building stock in Germany, which is a huge amount of savings. The success of this pilot project has then inspired others to follow suit and the whole concept to develop further. And there is now a global network of practitioners building to the Passive House standard in the region. And more importantly, they are pushing for general change and transformation of how we build. There are many aspects to this transformation. Some of this include training, making energy efficient building components the norm, providing quality assurance tools and processes, and last but certainly not least, enabling meaningful policy change. It is extremely encouraging to see that the concept is gaining increased recognition. Some municipalities have adopted the Passive House performance metrics, whereas others point specifically to the standard as a pathway to meet their climate targets. Glasgow is an example of integrating Passive House into their decarbonisation strategy, as we heard in the film earlier, as are other cities, for example, Madrid. On a higher policy level, Passive House has had a strong influence on shaping the UNECE's framework guideline for high-performance buildings, and we really look forward to further collaborating and developing this international initiative. Brilliant. So just imagine, if we take back a step, if every building was built or retrofitted to this highly energy efficient level, then obviously the first benefit is that annual emissions to operate our buildings are significantly reduced, a lot lower. But the second benefit to this is that it actually becomes feasible, it becomes a reality that we are able to cover the small remaining amount of energy needed from sustainable resources, renewable energy resources.
Jessica, thank you hugely, but I'm afraid we're out of time. And that was yet another example of a great opportunity. Huge thanks to all of the speakers for their self-discipline. As a final comment from me, I said at the start, we cannot meet net zero without decarbonising our homes. The good news is that we can do it, and I think we have demonstrated here today that we can do it. And not just does that decarbonise our homes and help the planet, it creates economic opportunities. It's a brilliant opportunity for a mix of public and private finance, public and private actors to work together with voluntary sector and charity organisations, with communities, with people all over the world. If we decarbonise our homes, make them more energy efficient, the 52 million people that Olga talked about who can't afford to heat their homes will live in warm homes. They can then have a better, more stable life. This is an agenda which allows us to make a profound difference to the lives of individuals, to the impact at local economy level, to the impact at national economy level. It creates new jobs doing things that are useful for us, all of us, in all of our homes, and it has the potential to help us to meet that compelling target of 1.5 degrees centigrade. We know that with the right national leadership, clear long-term strategic thinking, and the right local leadership, again, a clear sense of a strategic approach to community development, the participation of citizens, we can do this. And we also know that we do not have an alternative. If we fail to do it, we will fail to meet the climate challenge, and we will continue to fail the lives of some of the poorest in our societies. Thank you hugely, all of you in the room and watching online, for your participation in this event, and please remain engaged in this challenge of decarbonising our homes. Thank you.